thank all the sponsors and thank all of you for tuning in here. I think this is going to be a fantastic conversation. Today, we are talking about zero trust architecture, and I always like to highlight the architecture part of it. We'll certainly be talking about that today, asking questions about that piece of it, because it is indeed an architecture. And of course, we don't want to forget the hybrid cloud piece of this as well. Very important as we lay out the superstructure here. I have my own sort of poll question there, and it has to do with how many times zero trust architecture was referenced in the executive order on May the 12th. Anyone want to take a guess? I don't want to put any of the panel members on the spot. 11, if I counted it right. So as you can see, a very important part of that executive order, along with many of the other things that are associated with the executive order. Very lengthy, I might add. I think one of the longest EOs that we have out there, most comprehensive. Let me allow the guests to introduce themselves. Let's start with Brian.
Hey, welcome. I appreciate the opportunity to come in. Brian Campo, I'm the Acting Chief Technology Officer and the Chief Enterprise Architect for DHS. Really excited to be here, and Zero Trust is absolutely something that I think we always look for a chance to talk about, so I appreciate it.
Appreciate you being here, Brian. Alex.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody also for this session today. Thanks, Luke. I'm Alex Chapin. I'm Vice President in the Public Sector Group at McAfee Enterprise. I've been serving and working with the federal government space for over 30 years now, and 22 years have been dedicated into the cybersecurity arena. And I lead, a security team of professionals at McAfee Enterprise, focusing on Department of Defense, intelligence community, system integrators, and service providers.
We thank you for all the work that you're doing to help secure the community.
Thank
Michael.
Thank you. Mike Epley, Chief Architect and Security Strategist for Red Hat's North American Public Sector. And like the other panelists here, been in the DoD and IC and industry for 20 years or so, and currently leading Red Hat's special interest group focusing on zero trust, and excited to talk about zero trust and zero trust architectures today.
Certainly a lot of interest. Thank you, Michael. Certainly a lot of interest around this with the community, both inside the federal service and, quite frankly, outside the federal service and across the commercial market as well, and all for good reason. A lot of activity going on there, and we all see it in the press pretty much every day. But I wanted to start with something basic, and that's just simply the definition. And I'm going to ask you, Brian, to give us the definition that you all are using in regards to the zero trust architecture, and then I'll ask the other panel members to weigh in and fill in any gaps if needed.
Sure, no, absolutely. And I think that's actually a really great question. I think too many times we think of zero trust just like we think of, many other technologies. It's something that we buy through products, or we buy through, a specific requirement. But zero trust is really quite different. And I think the first part that we really think of when we started our journey on zero trust was to consider it as much more of a true architecture, right? So we talk about zero trust, but we always add the architecture after it. It's a mindset change. It's an approach to doing security. But most of all, it really is this thought of changing the culture of security away from these ideas of blocking access or those sorts of things, to really evaluating requests. Zero trust kind of starts with the idea that nothing is trusted. It starts with the idea that every single request to any resource should always be evaluated. Policies should be applied. Constraints should be added, and we should do some evaluations of whether access to that resource should be granted, right? So that's sort of where zero trust starts. But then when you get into more of the specifics of it, it really is looking at things as if you were trying to define a single request around a specific set of purposes. You can look at any resource, whether it's a website, whether it's a piece of data, whether it's access to a system, whether it's access to a network. It really, again, follows that architectural principle that every single access request has to be considered. I think, and then when you bring those two pieces together, what you start looking at is the aspects of zero trust that really require you to think differently. The other piece of it that tends to get lost sometimes in the mix is really that cultural aspect, that mindset change. So I think when we think about zero trust, we're really thinking about it as access requests. We're thinking about it as policy enforcement. We're thinking about it as different places where we want to do consistency checks or access checks. And then we're really trying to change the mindset of how we think about security, getting away from those moat and castle types approaches to really thinking about it inside of every system, thinking about it inside of every gateway, thinking about it inside of every network.
Yeah, it's interesting because it really is a cultural a belief system. There's a lot of technology associated to it to implement it right. And as you said, it's not just sort of one technology that you plug in, but as soon as you say architecture, you're really talking about a constellation of activities that come together in order to implement something like this. Mike, let me ask you if you have anything to add there, and also maybe you can pull in the historical perspective of zero trust architecture. How long has this been around? Has this been around for 30 years and we're just catching up, or what's the situation there?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I agree with everything Brian kind of noted about the necessity to focus your culture and the context around the overall architecture of your systems when you're thinking about zero trust. I also like to think of it in terms of context and structures that we already have in place. One of the things that we talk about with zero trust is this idea of privilege and access management. And to a lot of degree, zero trust is an extension of that principle from simply, a least privilege model to something even more extreme and enforceable, a deny all and a zero privilege or a zero standing privilege model. And to that extent, we can think of zero trust as how to manage out allowing access once we've now denied everything. And ultimately, that means matching users to resources and figuring out to the context in which they operate and how and to what extent they need those resources in order to do their job and achieve their business objectives. And to a lot of extent, it's kind of a refinement of the idea and implementation of the idea of a need to know throughout your systems. Now we got here because we've traditionally let system owners and legacy systems essentially do that on their own, determine their own need to know, need to access, and how to match those resources. But we had existing concepts in our systems and IT infrastructure around tools that can help implement that and centralize and unify that. Things like policy enforcement points or decision points that can allow us to bring in that policy and make informed decisions about that. And of course, with the advent of AI ML, we could now even bring in more context to help us inform those decisions and improve the automation around that so we can remove the frictions that might be necessary. If we had to do that for every time we want to control that access.
No question about it. Alex, let me ask you, we were talking about the executive order just a minute ago, and I want to get your perspective. Again, a lot of things cited in the executive order around zero trust. You all are in a position there where you're striped across the entire, certainly the all the interagency, along with the private sector. What are you seeing out there in regards to the implementation, specifically what's being called out in the executive order? How do you think we're doing? What's the scorecard as far as the early pieces of that and some of the things that the agencies have been cited to do? And then Brian, I'm not going to let you get away with not answering that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the agencies that I've been visiting, I noticed have been trying to do it over. When I say do it, I'm talking about zero trust, right? Have been trying to start with some of the key principles of it over the last 12 to maybe 18 months, actually. So some folks have really got what I would say kind of a head start on it. And I think what's happening now is the EO is doing two things. One, it's accelerating, folks that are there and trying to implement it. It's helping them accelerate it. And then for others that, maybe are a little bit more behind the fence on this, it's kind of it's kind of a wake up call for them to take a look at where they should go. And like everybody said here already with Brian and Michael, it's all about a journey that's going to take a while to go, and it takes pieces of the architecture to change. And it's a mindset change too. Is kind of what Michael was talking about. In the past, we tried to segment things by doing firewalls and other kind of rudimentary things, but this is wildly different doing zero trust, because we're going down to the user, we're segmenting the users with microsegmentation, we're segregating the data, and we're making sure that the right people are going to the right places. And that takes a lot of different foundational building blocks that we need to put in place, right?
It seems to me it would take a lot of, governance, a lot of instrumentation, right, to bring all that together and fuse it together to actually make it work sort of real time, if you will. Sounds like a daunting task, quite frankly. Brian, where do you look around? Sort of, you're at one of the largest agencies there. You look around. Again, as we talk about, it's always a journey. Where do you think you all are in regards to that journey? I know there's a bunch of to-dos that came out of the executive order. 90 days, you got to do this. 120 days, you got to do that. But just generally speaking, where do you think you are?
Yeah, I think at DHS we're kind of lucky. We started our zero trust journey about a year and a half ago. So we looked at it as something that we wanted to embark on as we were taking on some other projects like our data center consolidation, our heavy move to the cloud. We were doing some network upgrades. We had a huge network modernization plan. So I think when I look at the EO, I think from a DHS perspective, we're actually in a good place. We've developed our implementation plan. We've got our responses to most of what the EO is asking for pretty well defined already. Obviously, there were a lot of things that we still need to do, but I think we're in a pretty good place. I do want to say, though, I think the EO was really well timed. I think that it does a great job of sort of bringing zero trust out into the forefront. It's adding it to the lexicon for anybody who's got anything to do with security. So I do think that, especially for those that hadn't started their journey, it's been a really important aspect of getting them to think about it. It also really helps in that, as I'm working with other CTOs across the federal government through the CTO Council and other things, I'm starting to hear a lot more talk and a lot more technology people, not just security people, but a lot more technology people, a lot more folks in the IT space thinking about zero trust. Which is a critical factor, right? Zero trust is not just something that CISOs do, and it's not just something that IT and network operators do. It really has to permeate into the program space. You've got to have program development teams thinking about it. They've got to be thinking about how they're going to secure resources inside their applications. Kind of like Alex said, not just putting a wall in front of the application, but actually thinking about it inside. So I think the EO has been very valuable from those aspects. And then I think, the final part that I'll say as far as the EO goes is I do think that it was very aggressive. And I think it was like that on purpose. This is a critical technology. This is something that we've all got to be thinking about. And it absolutely is going to be the way security is going to be implemented, a couple of years out. So, I do understand the amount of work that the EO brought with it, but I do think it's absolutely critical for us to take zero trust seriously and to really embrace the aspects of zero trust.
A lot of work. Seems like it would be a lot of cultural changes, some resource issues there that undoubtedly have to be accounted for. Michael, when you look out sort of across the community there, what are you seeing in regards to the implementation of this, in regards to respect to the executive order and sort of lighting it up as Brian has indicated here? How do you think the community is doing?
Yeah, actually, I think they're doing a lot better than we might otherwise think. You asked a moment ago about the history of how we got to zero trust, but many again of these concepts, the groundwork had been laid decades ago, either through existing security practices, things like the Jericho Forum principles. And NIST and DoD, of course, have put out their own concepts of zero trust architectures and how to determine whether you're mature and whether you're moving towards those architectures. So the groundwork has been laid for many years to do these things. And now it is just a matter of thinking about this in terms of a more enterprise and holistic security perspective, the overall architectural picture, and then figuring out where those pieces are missing. When I look around agencies, I see, a lot of the agencies have bits and pieces of a zero trust architecture already. They might have taken steps to implement a lot of security hardening already, which is kind of the groundwork and kind of the base assumption for a zero trust architecture. They've also taken steps to improve their identity and access management controls. CDM, for example, has been a big portion of doing that throughout the federal government. And we've seen these pieces, already taking shape. And now it's just a matter of doing the survey, figuring out where we can improve and augment those capabilities. One of the big areas I see in that is essentially closing the loop on that contextual governance aspect, as kind of Brian alluded to. We collect a lot of data about how our actors use our systems, how they interact with those. But the important thing now is to turn that into an input into the access control process, where we can then make access decisions based on that data, based on the context of how our users are interacting with the system and their business needs. What kind of use case or business function are they serving by performing that access? And that applies equally well to systems as well as to people. And right now, it's a matter of cataloging those access controls and figuring out what the minimum access controls and minimum access are required, and how you can add or remove access as needs dictate, as opposed to providing that blanket access.
And undoubtedly do it in sort of a real-time fashion. Alex, we talked about zero trust, and I want to touch on hybrid cloud as well here, right? Which is another piece of this. We can't, we can't fully implement a hybrid cloud kind of capability unless we have a good zero trust architecture. Let's talk about this journey that we're on, right? It obviously is going to take a period of time, perhaps several years, as people are describing. But what can we expect in an end state? If I'm rolling out a full hybrid cloud, I'm using a multi-cloud kind of environment, I've got a fairly mature zero trust architecture. What does that look like to me as a CIO? If I look around, what type of capabilities do I now have that I didn't have before?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the future, it's going to zero trust is going to bring us what I would call risk-based data-centric model that protects critical assets, critical data. And I think what a lot of people are finding out is that the data piece is critically important to understand kind of where your data is, where is it flowing. And we've been talking about zero trust through this whole session, but the cloud really is forcing us to make a lot of these changes. So now that we're moving to either workloads in the hybrid cloud, or whether we're having new SaaS apps delivered to us from different companies, I think what we're doing now is we're having to make a shift on how we're going to handle this. No longer the perimeter security, the boundary has changed, right? So where is your boundary? The boundary potentially is at the cloud level. Right. So then how are we going to secure that? We've been, pretty much protecting everybody, whether they're in a building or a campus, or they're VPNing in, and we're protecting them because they're actually coming into the building or campus. Now you have people that want to be able to get to data and workloads, and they want to get to the cloud, and they want to go direct to the cloud, right? In the DoD and some other circles, they call that the flow 3, right? So, how do we now enable folks to be able to go straight to the cloud in a flow 3 method and then still protect them, right? So we have to put new technologies in place that can, watch where data goes. We can protect where data goes. We can look at posture management to make sure that we're doing the right things. Like, in the old days, we were sticking servers and desktops, right? Now we have to look at how we're going to STIG, cloud workloads, how we're going to STIG SaaS apps, right? So that we can protect the agencies and the services and the co-coms from the adversary, right? So it's kind of wildly different, right? We have to look at the data, and we have to look at data loss prevention. We have to, with zero trust, you're going to assume breach. So you have to increase your visibility on all of these different areas, so that you can understand what's going on. And I think what, also changes a lot is, like automated, everything needs to be automated and orchestrated. So automated detection, right? Automated protections, automated responses. All of these things have to be coordinated and put in place. And I think that's where the future is going to go.
Sure, and as you roll out this cloud technology, you're right. The days of sort of guards, gates, and locks goes away, and your boundaries sort of everywhere and nowhere. You made a statement about STIG. Could you let the audience that may not understand what STIG is, just so they know what that is, as you referenced it there?
Yeah, within the DoD, it's a way of putting security controls in place. So if you're going to implement something and put it onto the network, you need to make sure the proper security controls are in place before you can place it on the network. You just can't take all the standard controls that come with you when you buy a widget, right? Well, we need to start looking at the cloud the same way. I mean, just because you buy a SaaS application from a manufacturer, that doesn't mean it's locked down and in the best interest of your agency, right? So we have to take a look at what protocols are open, what APIs are open, right? We have to understand, what I call, a lot of, you asked this question before about like kind of what's going on. Well, most of the things I see is going on right now is everybody's trying to lock the front door is what is the way I call it. They're trying to do a software defined perimeter. They're trying to encrypt the channels going into the cloud, right? But we have a lot of work to do on what I'll call the side windows or the back doors when it comes to cloud, because there's a lot of different facets to the cloud that are still what I'll call open or that need to be protected. We need to take a look at those things. And your data, even though you're putting it up into one cloud, could be traversing to a second cloud, and is everybody, paying attention to that?
Sure, and that interconnection, if you will, needs to be. You can't just completely outsource the oversight of that capability, and that gets really tricky. Gail has a question here, which I thought was interesting. I'm going to ask Brian, how are you developing the zero trust skills of your workforce? Good question, Gail.
That's a great question. Yeah, so that is actually something that we are working on pretty heavily. We've got a couple of efforts at DHS that we're trying to do. We have actually taken a pretty aggressive stance as far as training in zero trust. We've got a couple of training partners that we use, but we've actually done what we're calling technology stand down days. So we did it with cloud as we were getting ready to start our cloud initiative. We've done it with zero trust. We've actually taken days where, most of the IT workforce, most of the folks in OCIO, take an entire day to get up to speed on a particular topic. Kind of going through the 101 courses in the morning, jumping into some, 201 courses around lunchtime, and then breaking out into some specific courses based off of what their jobs are in the afternoon. So that has been hugely helpful, kind of getting everybody on the same page. And again, sort of raising the level of knowledge of the entire workforce. The other side of training, though, I think is also getting into a lab. And I'm not a big fan of just spending massive amounts of time in the lab, but do get some, some specific use cases defined, sure. Get a few things that you want to address with zero trust, and then get into a lab and work them out and do some pilots. Especially if you can do them in a small scale, those can be incredible learning experiences. You can also develop some best practices as you're going on. And then the last one that we've done at DHS is building some reference architectures and reference implementation. So as we at the headquarters OCIO level have been working through some of our zero trust work, we've also started putting out some resources, which would be a reference architecture on a topic like a cloud security gateway. Putting that out so that other of our components and our partners can take a look at it, and then reference implementation so they can start from a baseline. They have some minimal amount of implementation and take those and run with them, make them fit for purpose and customize as they need.
I love the hands-on aspect of that. I think that's awesome. I'm going to jump to another question here. I'm going to ask you first, Brian, and then I want to hear from the other panel members as well. And this is around what I like to call, what is zero trust not going to be? In other words, what can we not expect to see once we have a fully realized zero trust architecture? I think about, okay, if we had this fairly matured at this point, would we still end up with a solar wind situation? Would we still end up with a ransomware situation? What do we not get when we fully realize this, that it's going to have to be accounted for in other ways?
Yeah, I think this goes back to one of the things that Alex and Mike were talking about earlier, right? So this is not a panacea. This, zero trust is not going to be the end of security issues or risks to IT. What it is, it's changing the paradigm that we use to evaluate those risks and address specific risks that we see. Kind of going back to what Alex said, right? We're changing our security from a lock on the door to the idea of a bouncer or a security guard at the door, right? You're still going to have options that the security guard could get overwhelmed and you could have people break into the building. But what you're not going to have is you're not going to have somebody picking the lock. So things like ransomware, the SolarWinds attacks, I want to say that we will be better prepared for them and we'll have further layers of defense in place such that if something like that happens, it won't happen to the same magnitude as what either of those happened. But to say that they'll be avoided would be, a little premature and a little idealized. The other thing that I really think we can think about is, as far as what we're going to get with zero trust or what we're not going to get with zero trust, is I do think that we're going to start to see boundaries become less important, right? So, talking about both Mike and Alex said, moving to the cloud with zero trust, it's critical to think about things in terms of zero trust. Because in the cloud, you don't own your boundaries anymore. Your boundaries at some point are going to be things that other people have to implement for you, or things that you're not going to have control over. So you're going to have to start thinking about more ways and better ways to actually evaluate your risk, develop risk mitigations, and really have second and third layers of defense.
Mike or Alex, would you like to chime in on that? Very comprehensive answer there from Brian.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in there a little bit. A couple other issues I see is, we talk about zero trust in terms of, no trust, and it's literally in the name, but it's not really no trust. There's plenty of places where we have to build trust relationships within our systems. We're just more explicit about it. I think the other big thing that we'll find as we slowly adopt zero trust throughout enterprises, the trust is a lot more distributed than we ever thought. That there's a lot more people and systems that we do have trust. And, this goes to the perimeterization. And the whole idea behind microsegmentation is you can isolate those areas where you do have to trust systems and people. But one of the things that we do trust explicitly in most of our organizations is our people. And zero trust can't necessarily stop the insider threat problem. You're by definition going to be at some point trusting those actors in your system to access other systems and other resources and other data. And you can't necessarily stop that ahead of time. Zero trust might try and provide faster time to the remediation or locking down to that system post-incident so that you can contain that, those incidents into those smaller segments, but it can't necessarily stop that problem. And that also kind of brings up the other issue there is ultimately, even if you can reduce the number of places that you have to trust these systems and actors, you're going to have a root of trust at some point, and probably multiple roots of trust. And you still have to very tightly control those roots of trust, whether that's in your supply chain, whether that's in your identity and access management or other places. Those things will still be there, and you just now have to apply other mechanisms and other remediations and mitigations to those.
Yeah, that multi-level security, sort of that trust but verify concept really comes into play here, and constantly revalidating seems to be a big element of how this architecture is going to work once it's fully realized. Alex, any thoughts on that before we jump to our next question here?
Yeah, absolutely. Ransomware, you mentioned that. Yeah, I don't see it kind of going away. I think what will happen is, the criminals will probably, the folks that put in the better defensive measures and zero trust measures, make it harder for them. They'll gravitate to the folks that are not doing it, right? They'll go to the easier pickings, right?
Right. Who's got their windows unlocked?
Yeah, exactly. They'll go to the easier targets. And then, the folks that really do want to get into the zero trust ones, I mean, I see it being just harder for them to do it. Can they get in? I'm sure they can get in, but the lateral movement will be difficult for them at that point, right? So it will be, much more difficult for the adversary at that point. So nation state actors, will continue to press and advance their tools and their techniques and tactics. So we're not going to see a let up on that. And then when you say supply chain, yeah, I mean, that is a tough one because we're trying to trust our supply chain, as Michael was talking about. We have to get to a point where we can, I don't know, somehow take the applications and use zero trust principles for them on how we can either, sandbox them, test them, do something, that goes a little bit beyond just, hey, I trust you and thank you very much, right?
Sure.
So,
seems like the collateral damage over time gets less. The recovery time gets shorter in this kind of environment. But the adversaries always come up with another way to find their way in, or at least attempt to find their way in. Let's talk about the journey and the timeline on the journey, Brian. All of you were asked to put these plans and submit them to OMB. I know you all have done that. How long realistically does this take? I hear different things. I've heard different private sector companies that have been at this for a while, that it's taken them, 6 to 7 to 8 years to implement this, and then perhaps you're never done.
Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to your last point, and it ties into what all of us were saying is, our adversaries are constantly updating their tactics, techniques, and processes. So we always have to be updating our security. So I don't think you can say how long does the journey take. I think it is a journey that is going to go on. At what point can you feel better about your security? And maybe a better way to think about it is, at what point does zero trust start to make an impact on your security? And at what point do you start to see the benefits of implementing zero trust? For that, I would say what we saw. So again, we've been working on zero trust for about 18 months, headed into, close to 2 years now. And we are seeing significant risk reductions, right? We're starting to see more actual implementations that are tangibly reducing risk. We're starting to see our metrics on things like a MITRE attack start to show that we're actually making impactful changes. I think we're also starting to see a lot more proliferation, and we're getting deeper into some of the zero trust aspects. The other point I'll say, sort of along the timeline, is Google started zero trust with their Beyond Corp. What was it, 6, 7, 8 years ago? So they're still continuing to refine it. They're still putting out changes to their architecture, and we really appreciate where industry's going with it. So we're going to continue to evolve. We're going to continue to take zero trust further and further deeper down the stack. But I think I would look at it in sort of two ways, right? One is, when can you start to see those tangible improvements? I would say 12 to 18 months, you should start to see that. And then really don't think about zero trust as an endpoint. You got to think of it as a constant evolution to mitigate what our adversaries are trying to do.
Michael, any thoughts on that?
Sure. And I'd like to extend that idea of an evolution. A lot of zero trust and adoption of zero trust is going to depend on more general IT modernization improvements. Legacy systems were often not designed with these concepts in mind. They're a huge drag on our ability to apply and prioritize new initiatives to implement zero trust architectures, or to conform to those principles. And it's going to be critical, and our leaders and CIO leaders and the federal government have acknowledged this, that we have to get rid of these legacy systems in order to move forward on this. So I think that's going to be the important part about, if you want to move towards zero trust, focus on that modernization first and try and eliminate those legacy systems, or, adapt zero trust concepts to those, or isolate those into their own tightly controlled perimeters. And that's a strategy I've seen work, but there's a lot of legacy systems out there. It's going to take a huge amount of time and effort to actually modernize all those systems, and especially given the current drag. But we have mechanisms in place right now through like TMF, for example, to focus in on those modernization initiatives. And Congress has recently relaxed the rules, and the administration has relaxed the rules about how we can apply those funding streams to these modernization initiatives as well.
Right. I was going to Right. I was going to point out that the TMF, I'm glad you cited that and call out OMB and the Hill for really supporting that. Margie Graves, who was a big piece of getting that whole thing over the fence. I want to shout out to her as well and to making that happen and really starting to get that technical debt out of the way and build in this framework as you're doing that, I think is really important. Speaking of framework, somebody asked a great question here. And Brian, I'm going to pick on you again here. And there's the what they're stating is there's several zero trust frameworks and maturity models circulating. Does DHS have a favorite? I don't know if we want to call it a favorite, but what is your implementation process playbook? So, what standard is DHS using as far as zero trust architecture is concerned?
Yeah, so I don't know that we've got we have not adopted a single framework, and yes, there are several frameworks, and honestly, all of them are good. All of them will help you get there. What we really did was we started by thinking about things in terms of developing use cases, developing tangible improvements, and specifically defining how we wanted to reduce risk. What we then did was we took each of those use cases and kind of looked at them in a practical, tangible way, and then started cherry picking pieces from multiple frameworks. I mentioned Google's Beyond Corp, obviously Gartner, Forrester. They all have different sort of frameworks or guides that you can use, implementation plans that you can use. But we didn't pick a single one and sort of say, okay, we're going all the way down with this one. We're going to follow this to the T. We really looked at it from a practical perspective. We took it as far as trying to make specific improvements. For example, I'll kind of give us the sort of starting point for us was we have a massive data center consolidation effort. We've got to move to the cloud. We had a 12 to 18 month plan for that. So what we did was we said, okay, what can we implement as we're moving to the cloud, as we're moving into this hybrid environment? What are the specific zero trust technologies that'll help us get there? And that was where we picked out the Cloud Security Gateway and the Cloud Access Security Broker and really said, okay, this is where we're going to start. We're going to pick these two, which are really applicable across all of the different frameworks. And we said, these are where we're going to begin. We're going to implement these. We're going to figure out what those do to our security posture and then start working through other use cases.
Yeah, I was going to bring up, let me ask you, Alex, the keys to success here. When you're out there working with these various clients on this, what do you see as the key ingredients that an entity needs in order to be successful as they start on this journey?
Yeah, it's definitely a mind shift, change in mind shift, right? So you have to look at the culture of the way the cybersecurity folks have been operating since day one, right? And then now we have to change that culture to, kind of like a deny all culture. So it's very important to have leadership in line, right? It's important to have, not only the security folks, but the IT folks kind of in line. So you have to kind of, go through what I would call the entire organization to get that culture shift to start moving in a direction that is zero trust, right? So it takes, it's a little bit more than just buying a product and kind of putting it in. I mean, that's the start of it, but it's really changing your techniques and tactics also within your organization, and having leadership behind that is critically important.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to weave in another question here because I think it's timely, and I'm going to call this gentleman out. I'm sure he won't mind, Mark Emery. And he's pointing out that, we continue to talk about zero trust as a journey, and that's fair. But how do we deliver specific outcomes, right? Will we lose executive support if we have this sort of panacea, three-headed monster that's nebulous out there? How do we make the zero trust program tangible with measurable results? What is that OMB is expecting through the executive order? What are we expecting of ourselves to make sure year over year we're making very good progress there? Once again, I'm going to pick on you, Brian. I'll start there, and then we'll go around the horn on that one.
Yeah, no. So I'm going to go back to what I was talking about, just a couple of minutes ago, which is start with how do you want to impact security? What, again, we started with use cases, but you could start with a lot of different ways. But you do it through tangible implementations, right? I think the natural inclination and the way a lot of large organizations go about this is they stick a bunch of people in a lab They have them work for a year or two to develop this massive strategy, this roadmap, these huge architectural implementations. And then the state of the art has evolved in the year and a half or 2 years before they get that out and into the physical infrastructure. I'm a huge fan, and I think we in DHS OCIO are big fans of getting to implementation quickly, making tangible impacts, measuring your success, and then making sure that you can reuse and leverage those products. I mentioned the MITRE attack framework. That's a really good aspect to take a look at. That's where you can get that measurable impact. That's where you can actually quantify how your risk has been reduced. You can do that in ways that are easy to put up to the executive leadership. When you're trying to figure out where you are with peers or how you want to interact with peers, that's also a very good way. And then I would also say trying to get the word out, trying to work with partners, figuring out where you can bring in the program space. I mentioned that a little bit earlier, but digging deeper and deeper down into the technology stack to make those tangible improvements. But honestly, it starts with use cases. It starts with having measurable impacts to security.
Yeah, what gets measured gets done. And at the risk of having every cabinet level CIO strangle me, it seems like maybe this is a good one for the FISMA scorecard, right? Some version of that. I just think that's a good way to keep focus on it, keep attention on it, make sure that the funding is there too, right? So that you all can implement the things that you need to. You can't do that through thin air, right? There has to be some resources associated to that and stitched to these various elements. I think that's really important. Mike, let me ask you, Brian sort of alluded to it, but where do you start? How do you start? For those, well, I go back and I think about the survey that we did at the beginning of this session, and there's a lot of folks that are just starting to think about the journey that they're going on here. Where do you start, right? What's the first step? What's the second step?
Yeah, thanks for that question, because I think Brian sort of hinted at it, and I'll pull that thread a little bit, which is we have an existing risk management framework. This is the method by which we figure out how much risk we're willing to accept and how much we have in our current environments. And that's a great framework for us to prioritize and identify what we need to do to improve on that. To a lot of extent, that risk is security fundamentals, and just looking at our security fundamentals and make sure we have that security culture will help and do a lot to reduce that risk. And then pulling on the use case thread a little bit too. If we look at from our basics of security and the fundamental use cases and the corresponding risk, we look at our threat environment today. It's changed as a result of a lot of our work from home, for example, and the increasing use of VPNs. This is a huge change in our risk profile and our threat environment. And if we want to look at zero trust, zero trust is all about deperimeterization. And the idea that we have VPNs that protect critical assets, for example, is antithesis to a zero trust architecture. And if we can eliminate exploitations that have been seen through VPNs and are being actively exploited and known through like the MITRE framework, that would be a measurable improvement in our risk profile. Context and risk driven and an immediate result. And then we can continue to march down other use cases and other threats and risks that we see in our systems and apply the same process to that. I would start also too with the basics. Zero trust is all about identifying the actors and resources in your system that you need to protect. And the existing accesses are often in our systems way overbroad. We have, standing administrator accounts in many of our systems, or single accounts that are used throughout our systems that have little dynamic access control applied to those. And those kind of things, just knowing where those are so that you can prioritize those as places where you can apply zero trust concepts and access controls to, are going to be critical towards immediate risk reduction there.
Basic blocking and tackling on the early startup. Alex, no question that you've seen a lot of early adoption here. Can you share with us some lessons learned that you've seen in the early adoption of this architecture, and maybe some of the hybrid cloud stuff too, and bringing those together here that you'd like to impart some of that wisdom on us?
Yeah, I think that, and we've kind of talked about this earlier, where, the workforce needs to get, to a different place when it becomes, cloud ready, cloud savvy, right? And if you're talking about security, there's not enough people in the workforce today. So, I've seen a lot of folks starting to do testing around like identity management, software-defined parameters, CASB, DLP. And there's a lot of folks that, it's kind of really a whole new world of, putting protections in place. And people are not very familiar with these tools and how they work. So, I'm seeing a lot of, people putting stuff in labs, kind of like what Brian was saying earlier. You got to get into the lab, start seeing how these things work within your environment. There's a lot of education that's coming from the manufacturers about how these things work and how they integrate into, together with what you have today, and then potentially what you're looking for in the future. And, not all software-defined perimeters are the same. So, I'm sure there's a lot of folks on this from different agencies that are finding this out. There's not all identity management, not all CASBs are the same. So what it's taking is a lot of folks just doing a lot of research. Obviously, maybe looking at the Gartner reports and Forrester reports and different reports, just kind of get a start, but then getting things in and then trying to see how it works at a pilot, at one campus or one base or one area of the network, and then from there moving on. So, and then again, it comes back to the culture piece of how do we, train, man, and equip, everything that we're going to do when we're making the shift and going back and working with, the SOC and different TTPs of how we're going to, take this in and use it as an organization is very important. And there's, a lot of people are spending a lot of time around that also.
Quite the tectonic shift. Another great question that's come in here from Drew. Brian, this one's yours. As CIO puts new security architecture policies in place, what is the strategy for sharing with the DHS components? Great question. Mandates? ? Technology sharing? ? Shared platforms, etc. Good question from Drew.
Yeah, I have to say that all of these questions have been great. Actually, great audience, Luke. So I think what we try to do, and I'm gonna not talk specifically about security architecture, because I think what we try to do is pretty consistent across any kind of technology. It applies to hybrid cloud, it applies to zero trust, even applies to some things that we're trying to do as far as even customer experience. But what we try to do in OCIO and specifically in the CTO's offices, we try to think about things in terms of practical examples. We know that it's not as easy for the components because they've got missions they've got to do. They've got to share resources between critical mission priorities and some IT priorities. So what we try to do is get out in front of those technologies. We try to think about them, and as we did with Zero Trust, we started with this quite a while ago. Everything we built, we put out reference architectures, reference implementations. We've put out a lot of guides, and we've tried to think about them in terms of reuse. So when we put out any kind of technology out of OCIO, our first goal is to put it out such that it can be reused, it can be customized and made fit for purpose. To a couple of the different points that Drew was talking about, mandates. Sometimes mandates are necessary. We try to stay away from mandates. We try to use collaboration. We've got a variety of councils, especially in the IT world in DHS. We've got CISO council, CTO council. We've got councils around specific activities. We actually have a zero trust action group that we started shortly after we started our zero trust journey, where we bring the components in, bring in speakers from NIST, from CISA, from some of our partners to talk about zero trust.
So I would imagine that's being run by you?
Yeah, so the Zero Trust Action Group is run by the CTO's office. I've got a couple of folks that are brilliant as far as Zero Trust goes, but we're also doing that about so many other things, Agile, SecDevOps. We've got, we try to build collaboration into everything that we do in technology. And then that idea of shared platforms, that's an interesting one, because I think there is inherently some overlap between what we do in OCIO for DHS and what the components do. But because of the disparity in networks, you've got CBP, Customs and Border Protection, which is out on the fringes. They're out past where our DHS network operates. You've got FEMA, who's operating networks that are stood up and torn down on a daily basis. We have shared implementations, but we don't necessarily always try to rely on shared platforms. And again, that goes back to what Zero Trust is trying to teach us is we can't think about it as in terms of trying to put a boundary around something. What we're trying to do is educate. We're trying to give them tools, and we're trying to make them, give them something that they can use to meet their mission needs.
Educate and federate. All right. Well, we could go all day around this subject, but we don't have all day. But we have a couple minutes left. I want to give each of you an opportunity to, what's it going to look like in 2 years when we're talking about Zero Trust? Alex, let me start with you.
Yeah, in 2 years, it'll be interesting. As I talked before, it's going to be more of a data-centric approach to user and data-centric approach to what we're trying to do around Zero Trust. And it's like everything else. The adversary will keep shifting, and then we'll see new tools come to bear based on what shifts. It's always been a cat and mouse game. But I really believe that in 2 years, kind of like what I said before, it's going to be a data-centric model that is going to look at how we can make sure that, that analogy, lock the front doors, the side doors, the back doors between the clouds. And, and it'll be a different world because everybody will be mostly using cloud as an avenue because of the way it delivers speed, agility into the organizations. And we need to evolve. It's going to happen. And I think it'll be a completely different world at that point because we'll evolve to a place where security will be important, but the collaboration tools and the way we'll be able to deliver things to U.S. citizens and to different agencies will be quicker, better, faster. Right. And
really focus on that user-centered design, if you will, that customer experience, which will be awesome. We're all waiting for the day, right? Michael, what's it going to look like in a couple of years?
Yeah, I think I alluded to some of those same points Alex just made earlier, where, it will be a much more data-centric and data-driven environment for managing access to our systems. And, it's not just, tagging of data and resources, attributing of your identities and people. But the other big thing will be exploring and making explicit, the rules and policies that match those up. So we're going to be able to make data-driven decisions informed by policy about how we allow users or actors to interact with the data or resources that they need. And those will be encoded, need to know rules and business policies, legal or other regimes or risk management, informed by contextual data that we're collecting and processing in hopefully real time at that point. The underlying platforms will be the enabling technology. Cloud native solutions and platforms will just make that easier and faster to get there.
Yeah, real time, I think, is the operative word there, right? These things will be happening in real time. Brian, take us home here. In a couple of years, if I'm a software development application lead, and I'm working in, let's say, the department there, and I'm, been tasked to build a new system, and I look around, what's it going to look like? What can we expect to see? What kind of capability can we expect to see in this new sort of much more mature Zero Trust operating environment, hybrid cloud, et cetera?
Yeah, I think actually Alex and Michael hit on two extremely important points, and they really do hit to what the programs can experience. I will say, I hope that within 2 to 3 years, we don't even have to talk about Zero Trust anymore. I hope that we have made that culture shift. I hope that we have embraced the context that Zero Trust is how security is done. Where that gets to the programs, absolutely around data. Programs are going to start to think about how their data is being accessed rather than how are the capabilities that the program is delivering. I think we're going to start thinking about what data is involved in a view that the program provides. Is that data all supposed to be accessed by any given user? I think we will start to think about segmenting data. Right now, we're talking about segmenting networks. I think we're going to start talking about segmenting data inside of applications I think we're going to start to see a lot more policy implementations inside of applications. I hope that comes through a variety of service type offerings where, as Michael talked about, automated evaluations, real-time evaluations of security context, of security escalations, of data policies. And then I think the last piece is really going to be, I think we're going to start to see things done through a lot more services and a lot less through, specific monolithic applications, because you're going to have to make a lot more policy decisions. You're going to have to start thinking about data outside of the context of an application, because that's really where the next level of protection comes from.
And Brian, you have a lot of partners on the call here. What can they do to help? Right, they're listening to you explain sort of the journey here. What can they do to help? What's the most effective way they can help?
So, I mentioned it earlier, but one of the things that we really look for industry to kind of lead the way with is some of the ideation. As I mentioned, we've had a lot of partners, Gartner, Forrester, Google, a ton of others that really got these frameworks out into the common ground. They started building out implementations that we could learn from. Obviously, we're always looking for better implementations of applications to help us with our security. But I think the big thing, and obviously, I'm a big proponent of open source, but showing us what you're doing, helping us understand the context of where these solutions are coming from, and truly partnering. I think the idea that a company can put a paradigm out there through a framework or an implementation or even some open source code, and then foster the community to kind of rally around it, pick it apart, learn from it, and then take it to the next level. That's huge. And that's something that's really hard for us to do in the government. So industry has a huge opportunity there.
Together is better. Thanks. I want to thank all of you for taking your time out of your busy schedule to impart your wisdom on this community, and thank the audience for all the awesome questions.